Vignettes, and tonight we are going to do an episode on savior generals, generals that leaders, military leaders that James and I think are worth mentioning, that come to mind when we think of these type of heroes, and that's what they are, who save their civilization or their people from destruction or from horrible loss, and who basically don't get the credit they're deserved and come to be despised by their own people, which is quite tragic, but unfortunately is part of the history of civilization, apparently. Before we do that, though, I wanted to address some questions that I got from the audience and the listenership. And by the way, I'm perfectly open and willing and like to have feedback, of course, and James is too. And so since me and James are doing multiple episodes together, and who knows how long this will go, but hopefully it'll keep on going, I think that it's worthwhile now, since we've done a few episodes, to try to address some of these questions. And James, one of the questions was specifically with your, and if I misphrase this, please correct me, but essentially you were talking about the type of people and the amount of people that are capable of sustained violence. And, basically it appears that if at most roughly 30% of people can, be competent in inflicting violence upon somebody else. Is that correct by your estimation, roughly 30%?
Okay, so that information came from Lieutenant David Grossman's book on killing, and there were various studies that pegged this 30% for agrarian and industrial American men. Okay? And this was a huge problem. The U.S. military was very worried about the fact that most of their men were not trying to kill the enemy. However, the U.S. military was killing more enemies than it ever had killed before. Eventually, they managed through various methods to train people. I remember my brother telling me they used to sing songs about, when he was in the 82nd Airborne, about shooting pregnant women. Different things they do to dehumanize you. Instead of just showing you the techniques, they try to warp your brain to get you to kill people. And in Vietnam, they got a whole lot of Americans that weren't really cut out to kill people, and it's one of the biggest and most accurate tropes about recent American history, is that men that served in the Vietnam War came back hugely scarred, suffering from PTSD. And the PTSD was not something that was documented by the ancients, and it did not really have a place in folklore or military thinking prior to the industrial age. Okay, we could talk about some of that later, but the first of all, we're not talking about 1/3 of people today under U.S. military circumstances. They will get you to shoot at somebody. Most people, they developed methods. We're talking about the men fighting between the Civil War and the Korean War. They even improved things a little bit more in the Korean War. They started developing these techniques, and they improved it a lot by the time of the Vietnam War, and it caused grave psychological issues among men. Now, in the current military, most U.S. military personnel will never, in combat, be called upon to aim a weapon and fire at another person. This is only engaged in by a very small number of special operations infantry Marines. Okay, that's it. These are very special people. They're pre-selected, and then they're trained on top of that, and you pretty much got 100%. Yeah, they're going to go kill somebody. Okay, even if they know that's a person. Now, one of the things that was seen is during people fighting in vehicles, tankers and plane pilots would kill their enemy at a much higher rate than infantrymen, because they're not looking at another human being. They're looking at a machine that has monstrous qualities to it, and they're not seeing a person. Okay, so that was one of the things. If we want to look at the Great Revolution in killing, this begins in World War I, with crew-served weapons. Between World War I and World War II, the percentage of people killed with handheld weapons aimed by individuals was no higher than 2% and as low as 1%. 98 to 99% of people killed in World War II were killed by crew-served weapons. In World War II, predominantly indirect fire weapons like artillery. In World War I, predominantly direct fire weapons like machines. With a crew-served weapon, you are engaged in teamwork. You are very busy with the technical challenges of not letting your buddies down, running ammunition through this thing, and covering a certain area. It's very impersonal. The German machine gunners who killed millions of people in World War I they might as well have been operating a sewing machine, and they didn't often even see the people that they were killing because these weapons were now starting to get a great range. What the U.S. military was worried about was the type of situation that they almost had to deal with in Japan. They did not invade Japan because they nuked it. But the battles leading up to the invasion of the home islands and the Pacific Islands were very nasty. Okay, we're taking a lot of psychological toll upon the combatants. The men really resisted having to do so much killing at such close range against recognizable human beings. Okay, in a jungle environment, the U.S. military knew that with the Cold War, with the Soviets being the big enemy, where you're going to see a lot of combat was once again going to be in the insurgency, the light infantry, small unit tactics, something more like the Civil War, something more like Indian Wars, something where you're going to have a small group of people firing a small group of people. So they were very frantic to prepare for something like Vietnam, which they knew was going to happen somewhere, somehow, and get their men brainwashed to the point where most men picked at random. Remember, these are not selected Navy SEALs or special ops guys. No, these are just regular guys that are drafted. But they got most of them to point their guns at other human beings and shoot them. And then it melted their brains. They had basically the American experience with disastrous opiate addiction begins right here, okay, with the Vietnam War. Now, where the most killing happens in the war's understudy, and the war that this Marshall study was conducted about, where there was an exit interviews of men that were being discharged, and they asked them a battery of questions about what went down. I read a couple of dozen biographies of people who fought in this war. The best one, there's Company Commander, is very good. The Long Walk was good, by a Polish guy that got captured by the Russians. I'd have to say that the best one would be Iron Cross Sniper on the Eastern Front. The sniper has an intimate relationship with his target. He knows he's killing a person. He can see them, okay? He can tell a lot of details about them. 15 to 17 million Russians were killed during this war, mostly by crew-served weapons. The combat that this German sniper, I forget his name, he ended up being a vice president for American Steel Company, described with, and we're not talking about dying, we're talking about killing. You had millions of Russians killed. Not millions of Russians killing people, millions of Russians killed. The Russians would unleash days of artillery, okay? And then they would unleash their troops and their tanks. Now, the troops were herded into combat by commissars who were armed with submachine guns. And this German sniper, in his regiment, which was, by the time they got into Hungary, was reduced to like platoon size, he did most of the killing. He's paired up with a couple hundred guys, which become a couple dozen guys. Throughout the whole march back from the Battle of Kursk all the way back to Germany and the outskirts of Berlin, he does most of the killing in that unit. He is the sniper. He's got the best shot. He can reach out and touch people from farther away, and he's very good at it. Most of the men just supply his logistics. They just make sure that he's not going to get overrun, because the Russians that he's picking off know that if they just break across the field and run at him, it's not just him. He might be the only one shooting at them from a distance. But there's a bunch of other guys that they will be attacking if they attack him. And those guys will fire to defend themselves, even though they're not accurate at the range he is accurate at. Furthermore, these Russian troops are being herded like sheep through these funnels. He's killing so many of them, it's making them sick. Because if they turn around, or if they even slow down, they get machine gunned from behind by the commissars, by the Communist Party enforcers of the offensive. On the American front, the war in Italy gives you, and in France gives you two examples. One, in France, you have Audie Murphy. Basically wipes out a German battalion by himself. He wasn't by himself. He was the only guy firing the weapons. He's running around firing all the weapons. Everybody else was shell shock, or combat fatigue, which was what they were calling it then. Now, after he became famous for doing this, basically uses many of the weapons of his unit, which other men in his unit are not using, and he wipes out this whole German unit. They end up pulling him out of the line because they want to save him. They want to use him as a war hero. He ends up having a movie career. He has a high level of drug addiction, okay, and does not end up dying a happy man. He's extremely miserable his whole life. He knew how to kill. The mechanics are in him. He was a squirrel hunter when he was a kid, but then after killing many human beings, it scarred him for life. Now, the one thing, aside from crew-served weapons, indirect fire weapons, and firing at machines that are filled with people, but you don't see the people. Aside from that causing increased casualties over previous wars when guys would run up to each other with their bayonets and then not stick them in, and then one side would run away. Okay.
Yeah, that's what. I'm sorry to cut you off, but I heard that it's like even from like when we have records going back hundreds of years of bayonet charges, it's like people will not face up to bayonet charges.
Some nuts do. Now the French
all the nuts in the ancient world did, Yeah, well, we'll get
Yeah, but these are pre-selected people.
Yeah.
This isn't everybody. See, when you're asking me about everybody on the street or everybody in America, this is where industrial conscript armies come from. Exactly. This is where drafted armies come from. It's everybody. In the ancient world, you're like, okay, who can fight? Mm-hmm. Well, whoever doesn't step forward, okay, keep farming, get the food to us. We're going to kill people. Okay, so that's a whole different thing. These are pre-selected people. Now, this other aspect in World War II, particularly in the Pacific and anywhere where the Germans fought, the Germans inflicted 3-1 losses everywhere. And the Japanese suffered massive losses everywhere. One of the same things was driving this. One, they were highly trained. So many of them were recruited. They were not all fanatical. You'd have some who were fanatical. You did not want to be messing with the Japanese Imperial Marines or the Waffen-SS. I mean, these guys really believed what they were doing. Even regular line units are much more deadly than history predicts they should be. One of the aspects is Pervitin, which we now call crystal meth. These dudes were all drugged up. The German army on the drive through the Ardennes in 1940, these guys didn't sleep for like 5 days. They're just popping Pervitin. They're keeping going, okay? And they were hopped up. They wanted to go all the way to the sea and cut really finish the guys at Dunkirk. Look, Goering talked Hitler into ordering a halt. The generals at this point didn't want to order a halt because they knew once these guys stopped, they stopped because they were so burned out. They were pumped. They're doing multiple hits of crystal meth every day, and they're going into combat. So this is one of the things that was going on. There was a battle, a great book called The 50 Deadliest. There's 2 of these done by Paul Kirshner, who was a fellow Paladin press writer. And he also he did The Deadliest Men, 50 more deadly or something like that. And he also did a book on the history of the duel. Now, in one battle in Italy, the Allies pretty much consistently get their ass kicked in Italy all the way up the peninsula. Italy's a tough place to invade. I played Anzio, which is an old Avalon Hill game, a few times, and I can even use Italian troops pretty effectively against the Allies because of the terrain. Well, anyhow, there is one platoon. A platoon's over 30 guys, stuck in a house, surrounded by only a squad of Germans in this hilly country, not far from Mount Cassino, in the breakout from the Anzio beachhead. And this guy shows up there. The guy was a nut, never got along with anybody. Very common American hero war story thing. Like Cool Hand Luke, they say, oh, see, you did good in the war, but now you're in trouble, and now you're in here. You're on this chain gang. Well, this is very common. Guys that have trouble with authority and getting along under highly domesticated situations, from amongst this group of guys, you get your best war fighters. And this guy, I forget his name, he's one of these guys. He's also a country boy, I believe. He comes into this house to seek cover, and it's packed with officers, NCOs, and men who are just cowering. American platoon that's seen its first combat, and they're going up against these hardened, experienced Jerrys, who the Germans are outnumbered 4-1. But they got these guys pinned down in his house, and nobody's even firing their weapons. And he just starts going around to these guys and taking their weapons and emptying them at the enemy. Bazookas, machine guns, submachine guns, M1 Garands, Tommy guns, your 45 caliber submachine gun, okay, your M1 carbine, and he's emptying everybody's weapons at these Germans until these guys retreat, until the Germans retreat, because there's so much firepower coming from the house. Now, they're all in danger of being killed, him and the other guys. Some of these other guys get killed. He doesn't get killed. Okay, I mean, just being in this house, you were eventually all going to get killed. Yet, these guys are not firing back. Okay, there's a natural aversion amongst normal humans, and an industrial conscript army is taken from a normal swath of industrial humanity, just conscripted in there. They're not pre-selected as killers, MMA fighters, hunters, nothing like that. Although you will find that a high incidence of killers, they were hunters. They were guys that could point and shoot at a living thing, and they had the basic marksmanship skills. They ended up becoming snipers. And this was when I talked to one of the guys I'm staying with out here. He was a colonel, and he saw combat a few times in 2 different theaters. He told me that the guys are naturally good in combat, or the hunters like him that came from a rural background, used to killing man-sized animals, and smaller and larger. So they have these different immersions in the killing experience, and they have these different targeting practices. He said the suburban guys weren't worth a shit. Universally, they just weren't worth anything. The guys that the country boys got along with were the city boys, the criminals, okay, who grew up in their own dangerous environment and were used to a certain amount. Maybe they had blue-collar jobs, they worked with their hands, they got in fist fights on the job, they got locked up occasionally, they got drunk after work, and they got in a fight and they got locked up. Then they're in with even harder cases in the joint. So when you look at this broad swath of humanity coming from the rural, the urban, and the suburban, and most of them are at this point are coming from the early suburban, which is the suburban areas of the outer city, not the inner city. That's predominantly a suburban army, yet all the war heroes come from rural and urban settings. So that's not really a true, yeah, you're looking at America in a draft, but it's not really a true representation, because if you take out all the killers, you don't have any suburban boys. You don't have any guys with office jobs. All you have is the hunters and the criminals. You got the rural boys and you got the criminals. That's where all you killers came from in these armies. And today, the guys from the city that are killers are going into the military to get better at using weapons in service to their gang. which is the real affiliation that they have. And they're in the regular military trying to get into airborne Marines or something like that to try to get some good training, take it back to the gang. Almost everybody that's in the Navy SEALs, I think there's only like ever been 2 black Navy SEALs. Okay. These are all rural guys. Rangers, the guys that I'm staying in a camper where a ranger lives when he's home on leave right now. The guy up the way was an Army Ranger, the guy who I dug the ditch for the other day. The Rangers all come from the rural environment. All right. Most of your special ops guys, they come from the rural environment. So if we would just look at suburbanites, you know, we're way down from that 3 in 10 people who are willing to fight the enemy or willing to point a gun at another human being and shoot, even if that's the enemy. You know, so it's a sliding scale, and you know,
and
so
like
you can't say a blanket statement. You know,
and like you said before, it's probably more like 3% of the people that I live next to. I won't disclose where I live.
If you're looking at subdivisions, suburban subdivisions, the people are completely, for the most part.
Yeah, and then you said, and you clarified and said also, look, it's like you have, you know, maybe you have 30%, and then within that 30%, there's a smaller subset that are just straight psychopathic killers that can keep killing and not, you know, burn out from it.
Yeah.
Essentially.
Now, clinically, the U.S. military determined in World War II that 37 days was the limit. 37 days, everybody's
done.
So far gone that they're just sitting there shaking.
Even Ernst Younger had a freak out.
He went insane 3 times. He tried to commit suicide. He went out in the field and picked flowers and drank wine during an artillery bombardment. You know, So,
and he's a straight killer, by the way.
Right. So this guy was a straight killer, and even he went clinically insane 3 times. Tried to commit suicide. Got shot in the head. He had these different out-of-body experiences that helped him get to the other side.
And he had to do a lot of LSD afterwards.
Yeah. So even with your prime killers, it still becomes a problem. Very oftentimes later in life, it will still become a problem. You can see it with Alexander's men. Mm-hmm. These guys committed dozens of genocides, at least 12 genocides in Afghanistan. Okay, and they got drunk continuously. Mm-hmm. You know, that would be how they would decompress. They would get together and get hammered. They would get drunk so much that they would end up killing each other sometimes in camp.
Alcohol poisoning too. It wasn't a Macedonian party unless someone died.
Right. So there's a price to be paid. There's just a strong aversion amongst most humans to kill other humans. It can be overcome. There's lots of different ways militaries, cultures have overcome this. Some people do not naturally have this aversion. They're a very small minority.
Yeah. And then you and then it takes it's like you can be, I guess, I've heard it referenced by someone else as like a strategic asshole reserve. There's a utility to having these type of people. It's the problem is directing them in the right direction.
Yeah, break glass in time of alien invasion.
Yeah.
And
we talked about a
couple of guys like that.
Yeah, and we talked about like how I would like the Iroquois, the kind of Iroquois civilization does a good job of not becoming domesticated, but not going full Comanche.
There's another thing in the tribal setting. Okay. In the industrial wars, of the 20th century, and we can include Vietnam, we can include the last industrial wars happening in 2003, 2004, okay? Because using tank columns, using industrial levels of air power, very refined, but still industrial. Everybody goes into combat under the conviction that they're fighting for an ideology that can be adopted by all humans. that if you read the propaganda in the training manuals going back to uh, World War II, we are fighting for democracy. We're fighting to make everybody like us, to convince everybody to believe like us and to live like us. This country is still trafficking in that. So there is if you believe in the cause, if you believe you're fighting for democracy, okay, then you believe you're killing a human being. When you go to Iraq, you're killing a human being. Yeah, he's wrong. He shouldn't believe in what he believes in. He should believe in making money. Okay. He should believe in the petrodollar. Okay. He should believe that, that everything that comes out of Hollywood is great. Okay. So, yeah, but he's still a human being. And so this is upsetting. If you're an Iroquois warrior and you're swooping down on the Hurons, say, well, we're going to kill some tree eaters. These people aren't even human. They eat bark. I mean, just about every Indian tribe, their name means the humans, and everybody else is the enemy. They're not even considered humans until they adopt you in. Okay, so the funny thing is the word Navajo is Anasazi for the enemy.
Mm-hmm.
The word Apache is Navajo for the enemy. The word Comanche is Ute for fights us all the time everywhere. Okay. So in a tribal society, there is zero in-group violence. They do not kill their own people. They do not beat their own people. They do not beat their children. In Australia, the Australoids, they do that. Some of the African tribal societies do that. I don't know if any of the Asian tribal societies do that. The tribal societies in ancient Europe, as near as I can determine, and throughout the entirety of Amerindia, okay, Native America, did not do this, ever. Okay, they did not do it. They did not practice in-group violence. Okay, they did not beat their children. They thought that, that the English were insane for doing this. Why would you do this? Because this person is never going to be a reliable warrior, because you're going to break their spirit by letting their mother punch them in the face, when they're 5 years old. So these groups that for 200 years, the Iroquois successfully defend their territory. For 200 years, the Timucua people in Florida successfully defended their territory. For 300 years, the Apaches successfully defend their territory against the Mexicans, not the Comanches. The Comanches kicked their ass, okay? But they did so against the Spanish and the Mexicans, and they finally get beat by the Americans. Now, what you see with these tribal societies that punch way above their weight and fighting against the outgroup, you see zero in-group violence. Our problem with the psychology, and Grossman, I believe, does not get into this, okay, in his book, which was, granted, written like 30 years ago. He doesn't really get into tribalism. He does break down the fact that it's not just fight or flight. There's fight, there's flight, there's submit, and there's posture. It's a compass of these 4 aggression orientations, not fight or flight. Okay, so that shows you how denatured we are. That most of us still think it's just fight or flight because psychologists and psychiatrists have told us that, but that's not the way it is. So I don't think he gets into the tribalism, but the military unit benefits from a tribal level of cohesion, and they have found ways to become highly violent to the other group successfully. I think the U.S. military lost 5,000 guys in Iraq and killed 500,000 people, something like that. It's mind-boggling what these military machines can do, but largely crew-served weapons, largely remote, largely striking vehicles and buildings, not visible human beings. There's a lot of variables here. And even so, though, when my friend goes up to a checkpoint that was under his control and he finds an Iraqi family melted to their automobile, and he's the guy that had to give the order, it bothers him because he believes these are human beings. Okay.
Yeah.
It's not like as a medieval crusader and he's like, they're Saracens. It's like they're orcs, right? They're not even human because they're Muslims. No, he believes they're human beings, and he was told he was coming to their country to save them from their neighbors. And then here he just gave the order to cook 5 of them in the car, including women and children. So that's very damaging. You don't necessarily want to be spending a couple months with a guy that doesn't bother. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's what you've got, and now what you have constant PTSD with U.S. military. A friend of mine, it was who resents the military very much because a friend of his that was injured there got put on opiates at the VA hospital, and then after they cut him off the opiates, he died of heroin addiction. It was laced with fentanyl because he was trying to continue his own illegal pain management from the injuries that he got. Apparently, another aspect of this is machinery and noise. Anthropologist named Cochrane also made the observation that there wasn't PTSD before modern war.
Can I ask you about
part of it could be shell shock. They originally called it shell shock. Part of it could just be the storm of steel.
Yeah, I mean, and correct me if I'm wrong though, but I thought there was at least a few hints of. I mean, it'd be wrong to call it PTSD, but terror and psychological angst, a little bit, even in the ancient literature.
Yeah, same people are going to be terrified during a battle.
Yeah,
but we're talking about you come home and you are incapable of interacting with normal society because of what happened in the war.
Yeah, there's no documentation of that in the ancient world, I guess.
Right, and there are 2 quotes. Actually, the fellow on YouTube that does the Lindy Beige,
Mm-hmm.
he actually reads the 2 quotes of ancient evidence of PTSD.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and one of them might have been Aeschylus, who actually fought in Marathon. Okay,
the poets back then fought.
So it's something, it was there, it would happen. It's a big event, especially when every able-bodied man in your community can carry weapons, gets out there and fights. You're going to have guys that are essentially not psychologically cut out for it, that are going to be in the mix, and things are going to happen. But it does not become the norm until after World War I. Smedley Butler writes about 50,000 U.S. servicemen. 250,000, I think, were killed in Europe in World War I on the U.S. side. 50,000 of our men, 12 years later, were still vegetables in catatonic states in military asylums that he used to go visit. Now, part of this is the shell shock, the artillery, the fact that for days you could be subjected to a thunderstorm that in nature you hear once a year for an hour, and you're subjected to this for 3 days straight. Okay, so that's part of it. The other part of it, though, is the fact that you had the general population has been swept up in a dragnet, and they've been used to grease this giant industrial killing machine. And you just have regular people where warriors once only went.
I also think that I've heard special ops guys say that they don't have PTSD, and they attribute it to, not being badasses, but they say that they have more agency, like they're going out and doing something, they have a mission, killing people pretty much, but whereas if you're a regular infantryman soldier, it's like this low to mid-range danger all the time, and you don't feel like you have any agency. And
you got fuckers like those special ops guys hunting you.
Yeah.
Okay. You're a dog and the wolves are after you. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, now there's some special ops guys do admit to having PTSD.
Yeah.
So one, they don't want to admit it because they're elite. Two, they're going to have a much lower instance of it because they're special people.
Selective. Yeah.
Okay. Also, they're going to have a lower incidence of it because of their agency, because of that, what you just described. But there is something that's been creeping into it. And there is a problem, and it is driving military contract. Special operations guys in 5 different branches now. They're in combat rotations multiple times a year. The tours are now a couple of months. I don't know exactly what they are. It depends. Okay. But the tours are relatively short, but there's a lot of action.
Yeah.
Okay. Then you take some time back in training rotation, and then you go on another tour.
And they developed this. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, the problem is, after about 6 years of this shit, most of these guys are having problems. Okay. And what they opt out on is, this is what the military is doing. They're telling these guys that they've got to stay in for 20 years to get their pension, and they've got to be on at least 2 combat tours a year in these special ops units, because these are you only got 1,000 guys in the whole U.S. military that are actually killing people. They're in these various special operations units, okay, and they're under the Expeditionary Command, the Quick Reaction Force. They're in these different branches, and they're relatively busy. It's not the grind that Audie Murphy and these other guys would have had to put up with, where you're basically like grinding your way to Berlin and there's no end to it until it's over. But on the other hand, there's no victory in sight. They know that this country is going to go to war in another country. They're fighting in 31 countries a year, and they know this. They know it's the forever war and it's never ending. So they don't have a finish line. There's going to be no victory parade. And they aren't confident that they're going to be able to stick out 20 years of regular rotations into combat and keep their shit together. So they're taking 4 times the money, and they're taking their government skills, and they're going into military contract.
It's still surprising to me that I've heard that before, that gangsters will try to join the military and learn skills in the military, which ostensibly sounds like reasonable enough as a goal, but for them, but I don't see how they could have the discipline to last 4 or 5 years.
Well, some guys do. You're talking about the guy that's going to be the armorer. He's going to be like the number 3 guy in the gang. And you're talking about highly organized gangs. The guys most likely to do this are not the African American gangs.
Okay.
They are the Latino gangs.
Oh.
These guys are a military organization. These guys exterminate the African American gangs everywhere they choose to, easily. Okay. There is the paratroop. There was a para unit in Mexico that formed a gang. All of their former members formed a gang, and they sold themselves out to the 3 main cartels as muscle. Now they have their own. Now they have their own 4th cartel, the military cartel, separate from the police and the military, who both duke it out with each other, and the 3 major cartels. There's now the former paratrooper badass cartel that basically just traffic in one thing, and that gets them anything else they want.
Like these mercenary bands in the Middle Ages or something.
Right. So you're talking about the Latino culture. These guys have a real culture, a real society. I've told the story before, but I'll tell it to you again. Because I haven't told it to you. I was coaching a guy that was the physical fitness instructor for a juvenile detention center that housed 500 inmates and had 50 prison guards. He was one of 2 Caucasians in that facility. The other one was a big, fat, pale face, who was repeatedly beaten up and molested by many fellow inmates and by many of the African American staff members. He was a very large man. He was over 200 pounds, some 15-year-old, 200-pound, 250-pound guy that got severely abused. There was a kid that was well under 90 pounds, who was about 13 years old, who was a Latino kid. They didn't know what country he was from. Nobody touched him. None of the prison guards touched him. He was the only Latino in there. None of those 498 black gangbangers touched him. Okay, so what does that tell you? That means it tells you that his uncles are some bad people. Okay, so these are the kind of guys that are seriously going into the military to get weapons training. When the African American gangs Uh, they want one of their people to go into the military, just so that they can learn the basics of using a firearm. Not so that they're going to learn tactics or anything like that, because these people don't use tactics. It's all about having one shooter that's going to go out there and hose somebody down. They want to at least learn how to use the firearms, because there's a shortage of places where you can go conduct your live fire exercises when you're in the ghetto, because you got like these blue light cameras that are going to announce to police that they're firing in this area. Okay, and it's actually kind of hard to safely outfit these basements. Two homeboys, one of them accidentally got killed doing practice firing in a basement in East Baltimore a couple of years ago. So, but with the African American gangs, they would like to recruit a guy that like went through boot camp and actually learned how to clean a gun and like shoot. Okay, they would like that, but that's as far as their thinking goes. Where the Latino gangs and the Puerto Ricans and Dominicans are putting guys into the military, and some of them are actually pretty highly disciplined. Okay, the African American gangs are infiltrating the police force. Now, the Latino gangs are also doing this. There are actually, in the LAPD, there are actually Latino police gangs that are dedicated gangs within the police department. Okay, so your African American guys are more likely to infiltrate the police department and get a couple of the guys on the inside, and then that guy can give them some handgun handling advice. Okay.
Yeah.
Or they're going to just they're going to buy their weapon from some redneck, and they're going to go out in the country, and this redneck's going to teach them how to shoot. Okay. Or in return for some drugs or something like that. You know, and speaking of the Baltimore gangs, as of 1998, the FBI listed between 200 and 210 gangs in Baltimore City.
Good Lord.
Now, these are sets. These aren't like something like the Crips. Like in Baltimore, you got Crip 52. That's just a Harlem Park neighborhood, and they call themselves Crip 52. Okay? That's just a neighborhood. These are like little neighborhood gang sets. Now, dozens of these gangs become extinct every year because amongst these criminals, you basically have a 1 in 5 killer rule. 1 in 5 of these guys is a killer. Most of them will stand up and fight, particularly if their buddies are there. Okay. But still, only about 1 in 5 of these guys are like reliable killers. Like this guy is going to go out, you know, somebody's dead. Okay. He's going to go clear that corner, and whoever's slinging crack on that corner, he's dead. Okay. Because so-and-so's got the gun and he's that guy. Okay. Now, what happens is you usually have 2 of these guys in a gang set of a loose to tight affiliation of 10 people. You got 10 guys in a gang set. 2 of them are basically killers. One of them's a stone cold guy. One of them's the brains. Okay. Yeah. Once 1 or 2 of these guys gets killed, the gang just goes away because there's no longer that lethal element to keep it as a force. It no longer has the teeth to deal with the other gangs. You know, so that's about what it is. If you're talking about the hood, you're talking 2 and 10 guys, stone cold killers in a gang. Now, only 2 and 10 guys.
They're in
10 guys are in a gang. You know, so not everybody's in the gang, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And so again, it's a selection process. But even amongst the ones that are now, every one of them 10 guys will stomp you to death together.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Every one of them 10 guys will hold you down while one of them stabs you. Every one of those 10 guys is a killer under pack dynamics. Okay. But once you get them alone, only 2 of them guys are killers. And that's how you deal with these people. Okay. Because logistically, it's very difficult for them to all be together. It's suicide. They're all going to get bagged by the pigs, right? So they're split up. Only 2, and there's 10 of them. 2 and 10 of them are killers. Well, where are the 2 killers? Well, one, they're both banging the best looking babes. Okay. Okay, so one of them's active, one of them's not. They usually switch it. You figure two guys running the neighborhood. Well, one of them's resting while the other one's running shit.
Yeah.
Okay, so and then is he with anybody? Okay, the other guys. You know, so you have these different qualifications. You can get an extremely violent gang like the the Black Guerrilla Family, which is called the BGF in Baltimore. These are the guys that killed John Gotti in the D.C. jail. I think it was DC, maybe it was Western Maryland. But uh, the Black Guerrilla Family, Terrence White actually impregnated 4 corrections officers while he was an inmate. Okay, all right, yeah, he ran that shit with his dick. Okay, all right, so the Black Guerrilla Family is a place that could call on squad level units of killers. Okay, you could run into 3 of them guys, and they're all killers.
Yeah.
More than likely, it's 4 of them, and one of them's just a lookout. Okay, one of them's bait, and 2 of them are killers. Okay, it depends on how they work it, but yeah, you know, you have all these. The military deals with these use of force scenarios just like your criminals do, and just like the cops do. You know, most regular police just don't do shit until the tactical squad shows up anymore. They're just supposed to, like, you know, if somebody pulls a gun, they've got to try to shoot, you know. But if they get somebody holed up in a house or they got a standoff situation or something, they're just supposed to not get hurt and call in SWAT. Okay, so law enforcement, military, gangs, they all have these dynamics.
Yeah, and that makes sense. I mean, and I guess when we talk about part of the, I guess to segue into more going back into a different time, pre-industrial time, if you look at the ancient world and you see combat army, you know, a lot of the guys in ancient Greece, for example, since we recently talked about Greece, the most of the people except for Sparta were regular people that they may not run their farm day to day, but they're not training for hoplite battle every day.
Right. It would be like a Sunday thing. It would be like what they did in Puritan New England, where
Yeah.
one day a week the train band gets together and they train.
And it's kind of interesting to like when you have a lot of the champion type fights or the where you have like a challenge match this side if instead of having a battle um it's interesting when you know for much of the record that we have, I mean, even sometimes these are mentioned. um it's fascinating when you look at like um Alexander the Great, for example. uh you know, he when I think about him and I think about uh you know, a heroic figure. And there's a lot of there's so much revisionism going on and bullshit. But I mean, the guy, you know, was around, like his companions trained. He knew these guys, his top lieutenants or his top generals. Really, he grew up with them. He wrestled with them. He trained with them. He learned with them, and um, these guys were, you know, on the front line. Um, in battle. And a lot of people mention the different, like, you know, once you get to, you know, after World War One, you don't really have frontline commanders, you know, and even before that, you know, people talk about Napoleon and him being kind of out in the front here and there. But in the ancient world, I mean, that's what struck me as the most amazing thing. Not even just with Alexander, but with any of the commanders. Often, like, you know, when the commander's taken out, the whole battle's lost.
Well, that's
Um,
why the Romans didn't do that. The Romans had a managerial approach. They had the most vicious soldiers, but generally their commanders were managerial figures that were behind the lines and weren't particularly good. The centurion's different. The centurion, he's up there with his men. When Alexander the Great,
Hmm.
Harold Lamb wrote a book. Wow, 1930s maybe. Harold Lamb, or maybe 1920s, wrote a book titled Alexander, which is a novelized version of his life, which a lot of people would find a pleasing read. A historian named Hammond wrote a stripped down history of Alexander in the 1990s. It's a thin blue hardback book, and he just goes through all the facts and finds him to be a very pious and practical leader, very religious minded. My favorite book is Robin Lane Fox, who wrote Pagans and Christians. He wrote a book called In Search of Alexander the Great. Probably the best overall general history that is easy to read and isn't too academic. The best academic history, other than Hammond's, is by a guy named Green, and it's just titled Alexander. I also believe that's a 90s book. The Robin Lane Fox book, I think, was written in the 80s. Lamb in the 20s or 30s, and those are just four titles that people could probably look at uh, for Alexander the Great. But he was a heroic uh, military leader. He was brilliant, and his style of leadership reemerged in the Roman Empire under the Greek leadership that rejuvenated the Roman Empire mostly in the east, but they did invade Italy a couple of times to try to get it back. Um, and they got back to leading on a horse, what you would see in that movie Gladiator, where in that battle where the Roman leader gets on a horse and
Yeah.
after he sets the plan in motion, he goes out there and he does his flank attack and everything. Roman commanders didn't do that until they got Hellenized again in the 200s after the great disaster of the barbarian invasions of the 260s. Then you'd have people like Valentinian. Then you got the guys that are duking it out with the Germanic barbarians and fighting the Persians, and are now again fighting like Alexander the Great did, and the Diadochi did.
And the interesting thing about, I mean, I think there's a lot of, there's a lot of, another thing that makes me interested in Greece is because I see similarities, even though it's so far back between that world and our world today, with the political machinations and backstabbing and all that stuff. Particularly when you deal with Athens, but even with Sparta after they become an empire themselves. But you see how
It
they,
only lasts for 30 years, right?
yeah,
Part to shit the bed on that, and then they got run over by Epidaurus
yeah,
at Creta. All he
and
did is he just stacked his men 50 deep and turned into a giant dough roller, okay, and just ran over the Spartan king and his top guys. It was pretty simple. But phalanx meant roller.
and
So
the yeah, and it's interesting that it's like I mentioned this before, like how it's a misnomer to think that the Athenians were like sub tier compared to the Spartans, because you also said that the Spartans feared the Athenians, you
yes,
know, and
yes, and the small city states feared the Athenians more than they feared the Spartans. They looked to the Spartans as their protectors because they knew the logistical fragility of Spartans' internal structure and that there just wasn't a lot of Spartans. There's only 10,000 of them. They never managed to grow their population. They ruled over like 100,000 slaves, which they had to systematically murder. So they weren't that much of a threat to the outside world. They were just peerless warriors. The Athenians were The Athenians fucked a lot more. They had more kids, okay, because they were more like they wanted stuff. They weren't just barracks
Yeah.
and trying to be the perfect warrior. So the
Why?
Athenians have this avaricious quality that struck fear into the heart of smaller communities, and the Athenians conducted numerous genocides.
And why do you think that I know about the slaves for Sparta, that did their farming for them, and
Some
they
of them
had
fought too. 300 Helots died with the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae.
yeah, yeah. It looks like the more kind of precarious the Spartan situation got, the more willing they were to arm them, um and the and but the it's like you rightly say that Athens had a slave economy too,
Oh,
and so how, the silver mine
well,
comes along.
let me frame it out. Okay, so Athens basically 25,000 free men, 250,000 slaves. The silver mines are packed with 10,000 dying men constantly. They constantly need to be replaced.
So why did Athens not have the Helot problem that the Spartans had? Like they didn't
Okay,
constantly have to deal with.
Athens had 25,000 men. The Spartans had 10,000.
Yeah,
Okay, and the Spartans had a huge Helot population. Okay, that was dispersed.
yeah,
It wasn't jammed into this limited. The Attic Peninsula was very small and barren. It was good for olive trees and it was good for ports. And they had to get their wood and their grain from other places. So they already were in a position where they were bullying a lot of people around. And because they had this maritime economy, they could replace their slaves a lot. So they worked them to death was the tendency. They trafficked them a lot. It was probably their slave trading that got them that plague that ended up killing Pericles. Okay,
yeah.
the because they brought a lot of people in from Egypt and the East and stuff. It looks like Ethiopia and India were the main places that the plagues came from that afflicted ancient Greece and Rome. Now, the numbers of the Helots compared to the Spartans, uh, on the surface, it looks the same as what the Athenians were looking at, but it was really worse because they were more spread out. It was rural, and the um, the system of similars uh, that the Spartans used uh, didn't really allow for much upward mobility. So they had they didn't have a lot of use for outsiders. They'd adopt a couple of them, like Xenophon and Themistocles, maybe
Mhm.
some high status ones, but the Athenians used a lot of resident aliens who were not slaves. The Spartans didn't really have that. Only a couple of like rock star visitors. That's it. Yeah, and one at a time. But the Athenians had significant populations of resident aliens who were very useful, who had to serve in the military. Okay, and also if they got out of line, you could enslave them or kill them, and they didn't have any relatives in town. Aristotle was a resident alien. I think Isocrates was a resident alien also. A lot of the scholars were. So you had more than a two-dimensional system. That the Spartans just had these two dimensions. They basically had your similars, they had the perioiki, the ones that lived around, which are the people that they granted second tier status to, but weren't right there with them. They would be like the Acadians, that were like their faster running guys that had a little bit smaller shield. But then you got this huge populations of Messenians. The Helots were the other thing is the Athenians had slaves they bought from everywhere. The Spartans enslaved a larger tribe called the Messenians.
Yeah,
This would be
which
like the Xhosa enslaving the Zulus.
yeah, it seems
This
like
can go bad fast.
yeah, it's like you have an intact people that you just constantly for generations have enslaved. It seems
Right.
like
So you have that cohesion there. These were people that once had their own city. They even
yeah,
defeated Sparta once, and the Athenians had to come and help them out. So the
yeah, that's
Athenians
funny.
had
Yeah,
this atomized slave population. The
Yeah.
Athenians ran their society very much like America runs its society.
That's what
It
I'm
has a lot of
saying.
different factions against each other.
Yeah.
Okay,
That's
but
why
the
it's so
Spartans,
analogous.
yeah, the Spartans had this really. They didn't call themselves Helots; they called themselves Messenians, and eventually they got their freedom and they even had their own heroes. And
It seems
they
like the
got their freedom from the Spartans, I think, in the 200s and the 100s.
it seems like the Spartans in a way, like kind of like the Aztecs with those people that live around. The Aztecs, if I'm not mistaken, had tribes that weren't exactly on under their. They were
They're
like
subjugated
allied with.
tribes.
Yeah, they had
So
subjugate. Yeah.
the Aztecs didn't have a Roman system. The Romans, once they would conquer the Etruscans, okay, or conquer the Samites, then after a certain period of time, say, okay, you can be Romans now. You
Yeah.
can join. Okay. The Aztecs didn't have that. The Tlaxcalans were the Tlaxcalans.
Yeah.
They had to send so many sacrificial victims a year. The best looking girls had to be sent to Montezuma. It's the deal. So that's just like ongoing, never ending animosity. The Romans,
Yeah.
Romans had a much more corrosive way of conquering a people by, offering admittance into the cartel.
And it's like with the Athenians, it seemed like all the Greeks, very had a very high sense of their polis, of their people, but they guarded citizenship very very much. So that is a difference than today, where you know the Athenians were mercantile and a sea people, commercial people in a lot of ways, like today's America, but they, unlike today's America, Athens guarded its citizenship. I mean,
Well, the Athenians, that was a democracy.
mhm,
Okay, so you have in the Hellenic world of the time, you have in the colonial areas, you have a mixture of oligarchies and tyrannies. The tyrannies are usually savior situations where a
yeah,
leader who has arisen and has overthrown the abusive oligarchs who have their cabal of super rich guys screwing everybody over. Okay, so we kind of have the idea of tyranny reversed to how the Greeks saw it. In the Greek view, the tyrant was a savior. He could go bad. He could end up becoming like a bad king or an individual oligarch. Okay, but so you have overseas in the colonies, you have particularly in Sicily, you have tyrants. Then you have oligarchs. The predominant Hellenic form of government was the oligarchy. It is the group of propertied power brokers that get together in the back room and they decide what's what. Okay. Uh, Basically, just put it would be like everybody in America being told that, you know what, there's been something called the deep state that's been ruling you for 100 years, 110 years, and now we're going to be nice enough to tell you what it is. These 5 corporations and 15 banks run everything. You play ball, or else your life's going to be miserable and it's going to end quickly. Okay, that's what most of the ancient Greek states were on a miniature scale. That is more tolerable on a local scale than on a massive scale because it's not as dehumanizing. Then you have the Athenians with their democracy, and then the Spartans have their own weird ass monarchy that has 2 kings and a council of ephors that are like oligarchs without the oligarchic power. So, uh, so what the Spartans are just like this weird wild card
yeah,
that the oligarchies can grab onto. And so you've got the Athenians are fomenting uh, revolution in a lot of oligarchies at the same time by sponsoring internal dissent amongst like the second family who is going against the first family. Okay. And the first family is being supported by maybe families 3, 4, and 5. That second family is being supported externally by Athens at the same time that Athens is threatening the oligarchy. One of the families in the oligarchy is rebelling.
Yeah, it's pretty dirty politics right there. But
Yeah,
in
so there was a whole lot of that going on. So the Athenians were to be feared because they had the best navy, bar none. They had their hoplites were as good as anybody except for the Thebans and the Spartans. Okay, so they got the number 3 army, they got the number 1 navy, they got the most money, they
yeah,
got spies everywhere.
and they have access to the Black Sea. You know,
They got the
that
grain
yeah,
there.
and it's like they they seem to be highly effective at you know, they were all over the Mediterranean. I mean, they're so predacious. Like you could see them gobbling up one island after another.
They're
Um,
ambitious, okay, and innovative, just like the American GI that Victor Davis Hanson liked so much.
yeah,
Okay, that he was a farm boy, so he can fix that shitty Sherman tank.
yeah,
Okay, all right, so that's something to deal with. You know, so the Athenians had that. The Athenians had this ability to innovate because they had this mercantile economy. They were very greedy, and there was always a payday for the innovator, where the Spartan innovator would risk humiliation. His most important thing was his honor. So Sparta is this distillation of the Aryan honor culture, and Athens is kind of this distillation of
uh,
the Aryan invasion culture.
yeah. It seems like to me, I feel like the Athenians were inspired by Odysseus a lot. That's right. The clever trickster,
Yes,
the guy.
yeah,
You know,
yeah. It's almost Sparta against Athens is almost like Achilles
yes,
against this.
exactly. That's how I see it. And the other thing is, what's cool about one of my favorite savior generals in Athens is Themistocles, because he wasn't an aristocrat, you know, and he was a half breed apparently. You know, he was half Athenian and his mother was from somewhere else. I think she was from like they don't even know exactly.
One of those
Maybe
little cities they burned.
yeah, yeah, yeah. She was probably a spear bride, right?
Right, yeah, it's the girl with the biggest ass from Metholine.
And he comes up, you know, and he's, you know, these are anecdotes from Plutarch, but there's probably something to it. You know, he would basically get the rich kids to play with him. um, and it's just really fascinating because he basically you find him early on the scene. He's at Marathon, um, and so he knows the Persian, you know how the Persians are, and that's what's interesting too, because everybody's clamoring. You read the sources, and they're all saying Sparta's going to save us. It's so important for Sparta, you know, to get in this war. Meanwhile, cities are dropping left and right. Thebes, you know, goes to Persia. Thessaly goes to Persia. Um, you know, and it's like Athens is getting hemmed in. I mean, to me, Themistocles is like the savior general. I mean, it's like his whole story arc it needs to be dramatized in film. You know?
I have two from that period.
Yeah.
Okay, Brasius, the Spartan general,
Okay. Yeah.
who Thucydides faced,
Yeah.
and he defeated Thucydides, and Thucydides immortalized him and talked about how brave he was. He was very fair. He wasn't as pig-headed as the other Spartans. He was a guy that if he had not been killed trying to help uh, cowardly allies against the Athenians, he seemed like he was the only Spartan that would have been able to like decently rule.
Yeah.
Okay, but he was so brave, there was no way he was getting out of the other end of this 30-year long war. You know, he dies within like the first 5 years of it, but he had the highest character according to his enemy, who
Yeah.
was actually defeated and humiliated by him. Now, the other guy is an Athenian, Xenophon.
Yeah. Yeah.
Xeno, the first part means stranger. Now, what is Fon fire or what? I don't know what I forget what PHOM means anymore. But
Yeah.
Xeno means stranger. Well, he was just one of the captains of one of the many mercenary units from various Greek communities that had followed, I think, Cyrus the Younger to battle his brother in Upper Mesopotamia for the kingship of the Achaemenid Empire. And Cyrus is killed in battle. Then the Greek generals are invited to a parley and they're murdered. So the only thing that's left is the captains. So Xenophon and this psychopathic Spartan end up being, I think,
Yeah.
elected as rotating commanders of this retreat of these 10,000 infantrymen in this foreign country where they're surrounded by horsemen.
Yeah.
And they got to fight their way through mountains. So, and the Spartans ended up developing a very a like for him. Like I said, Gene Wolfe dedicated his novel "Soldier in the Mist" about the guy suffering from short-term chronic memory loss after the Battle of Marathon.
I have that book. I should read it.
I highly recommend it. Wolfe was probably the most sensitive writer of speculative fiction in the late 20th century, and he understood many of the iterations of the ancient mind, not just the ancient Greeks. Okay,
Yeah.
but he understood them well enough to present it in a fashion that a modern person could get into. Part of the technique he uses is immersion in storytelling. He has it just, and it won't make any sense. It will not be plot driven. At some point in the middle of one of his books, one of the characters will tell another character a story. And the story is just like its own little world.
Mm-hmm.
And see if you can, he's making no attempt to connect it to anything in the main plot or anything like that. But it's a method he uses to really get you immersed in the characters, because he's now using one of the characters as an actual storytelling teller. So he's putting himself out of the way as the author, and he's achieving a lighter narrative touch. So I highly recommend that. Soldier in the, or Latro in the Mist, which is a Soldier of Arete, or Soldier of the Mist and Soldier of Arete. There's a third sequel which I have not read, but he gets the military aspects and the individual combatant mechanics. Okay, in the book, I was good with his treatment of that, which says a lot because it's something almost everybody ruins. And what he really does is he captivates you with the metaphysical substructure of the Hellenic world. What these people believe is real. So Latro gets hit in the head during the Battle of Marathon. A Persian healer heals him before the army of the Great King starts to retreat into Persia, because he's an Italian mercenary. He's an Italic. He's a Latin mercenary fighting for the Persians. And he doesn't have any of his friends around. The healer, this Magi, gives him a scroll and a stylus and says, here, you write your memory every day, because every morning you wake up forgetting what happened the day before. So all he has is the distant memory of his childhood and the knowledge of his craft as a soldier. He's a professional soldier, and he has a falcata, like a kopish, and he's a prime stud athlete, so he manages to impress the people he run into. But he has a trade-off. It turns out he's cursed by the mother goddess because he fought a battle near Advent, which was, I think, the shrine of Persephone, near where the Battle of Plateau occurred. So he's cursed by the mother goddess to forget every morning when the mist closes in before he goes to sleep. But when he's awake, he can see the gods. He can see the satyrs. He can see the muses. He can see the furies. He can see the whole metaphysical substructure.
It seems right up my alley.
It's really, it's one of the best books that I've ever read.
That's high praise.
But that, I think it would help people of our period that have some stomach for fiction to kind of get into the idea of what these people in their mind's eye saw around them, because they were much closer to the earth than we were. So all these people were highly rural compared to us. Even the Athenians that lived in the cities were, were involved usually in agriculture or some type of produce handling, the olive oil trade, something agrarian was showing up in just about every aspect of even their urban environments.
That's what's interesting about Xenophon is there's a lot of things that survived that he read, the Hellenica, but also the Persian expedition that you talked about. But you also have
he wrote the Cyropaedia, which
yeah,
is the education of Cyrus. He wrote a book on horses. He wrote a book on hounds. He wrote a book on estate management.
and it's interesting that he wrote a book on the education of Cyrus and made a Persian nobleman. I this is again like one of those things where you admire your foe or the other, and
Well, they realized that they were cousins.
Mm-hmm.
The culture was very different. You got like these half naked dudes looking for the permanent tan. Okay. And they like to run.
Yeah.
And then the Persians are like heavily dressed horsemen.
Yeah.
Okay, but they have mutually intelligible religious faiths.
Mm-hmm.
They have a lot of cultural similarities. They had the same honor culture. The Greeks are more duplicitous than the Persians.
And the Persians, there's the saying that a noble boy should learn how to shoot a bow, ride a horse, and tell the truth.
Right, and I think Jeff Cooper, the guy that used to run gun scout training, firearms training, I think in Texas or Arkansas, he wrote a book called To Shoot, Ride, and Speak the Truth, something like that. But it was based on that. I think it comes from the Cyropaedia.
I think that's just excellent values. Excellent.
They knew that they were racially very close.
Mm-hmm.
They just went down different sides of the Black Sea when they came out of the Caucasus Mountains.
Yeah.
And there was a long period of coexistence with the Anatolian Greeks.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't particularly oppressed by the Persians. The one thing that's interesting is Darius, the king Darius II, who was defeated by Alexander. Alexander wanted him taken alive. He regarded him as his brother. Yeah. Would have probably let him keep his throne because Alexander just wanted to conquer as a means of exploring the world.
That's what
and Darius's mother adopted Alexander.
Yeah, and there's a couple things here in keeping it going with Xenophon and Alexander is that I've always had the inkling. I don't know if scholars think this or not, but I've always had the inkling that the notion that I have to believe that Alexander read the Persian expedition,
Oh yeah, his father did,
and saw the vulnerabilities, besides the Persian wars, but just really fairly not that long, but before his generation. I guess it would be, I don't know, 70 years, so a couple of generations before Persian.
So Xenophon is living with the Spartans and writing around 370 BC.
Yeah.
The Thebans are crushing the Spartans at Leucrata around 370 BC. And Philip of Macedon, hostage prince of the Thebans, is witnessing this.
Yeah. The stacking of the phalanx.
Right. This is his, and then that's Alexander's father. The jury's out on whether Alexander was complicit in his assassination. I do not think so.
I don't think he was.
His mother definitely was.
Hey,
Bitch.
that
Well,
woman.
they,
Yeah,
they
I
picked the
stand.
perfect actress to play her in the
Yeah,
Olive Stone movie.
you got to admit though. I think this whole thing about whether women had power or not, is such funny. It's like that woman may have been one of the most powerful women of all time.
Oh yeah,
Uh,
yeah. And
Alexander was trying to get away from his mom his whole life. She would write him and say, "Hey, when can I come to Babylon?" He'd be like, "Hey, I need you to stay in Macedonia."
yeah, he was adopted twice. This is a queen and Halicarnassus adopted him, and then
Yeah, women
Darius's
love him.
mother adopted him. So you know that Olympias would have killed both those bitches.
Yeah,
Okay, right? That was like he's like, no, I can't let you meet my stepmom or my adopted mom. Or that won't go over well. You'll be reading in her bed.
I'm sure that she was whispering in his ear that he was related to Achilles, his whole life.
Well, She came from Epirus. Epirus was the seat of Zeus of the Oak. The cult centered around Dodona. There was an ancient grove of oaks there. So this would go all the way back to the pre-Aryan uh, faith, and would actually remain. The Odinism is related to this and is not wholly Aryan. It's partially from that indigenous old European forest thread.
That's interesting.
Okay, and the nuttiest of all the Epirites was Pyrrhus of Epirus, who's probably the most fun savior general because that's what he did.
Yeah,
Because he was an idiot.
yeah,
Anybody said, "Hey, save us! We're being faced with an unbeatable army." He's like, "Yeah, I can talk somebody into coming with me. I'll be right there. We'll win."
yeah. He was
And that
crazy,
was
but
like
he
one of her great
badass.
grandnephews or something.
Yeah, and you know, it- I mean, Olympia, like she was running shit like after he died, or at least trying to. And it was amazing, like how not too much of an aside, but yeah, I just came to me like apparently one of the opposing armies after during the secession or Diadochi wars, her presence alone was enough to shame the Macedonian veterans, just to not fight, which that's powerful right there, even if it's not true.
Well,
um,
they got her boy killed.
yeah, they
Uh,
did.
yeah, essentially, he tried to commit suicide after they refused to follow him into India when he jumped over that wall,
Yeah,
went down the Indus River, and took that injury to his lung. He got a lung puncture. That, in the end, that combined with malaria and heavily drinking and whatever poison anybody slipped in his drink probably killed him. But yeah, he was going to make sure he died doing something heroic. Once his
yeah.
men decided they weren't going to walk all the way across the world.
That's what's so amazing is that like that last battle, whatever it was, he's like up on the wall, like and they basically refused to fight anymore, and he climbed up on the wall somehow, didn't get killed, was up on the wall, and then he drops down, and then they panic and just bum
He was
rush.
punished. He was punishing them.
Yeah,
That the um, the speech that he gave those guys. Oh, and the march back through Gedrosia.
oh yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I mean, he tormented these guys.
He was also
You know,
trying to
that,
outdo
that,
Hercules, though. I
yeah.
think he was trying to outdo the all the labors of Hercules in a way.
Well, and they were that he was just going to keep going because he wanted to do great things, and his tool was the army. It wasn't like a period where you could just have a ship and a crew and go all around the world, or
Yeah,
something
it
like
was.
that. He had an army. That's what he
It,
had.
it also in some of like when he was he was getting these kind of half breed Persians that had been bred with his Macedonians trained up to be his elite force probably before he died
Yeah,
because he was on.
that didn't go over too good with the Macedonian veterans
No,
either.
they were freaking out. But
Um, there, Stephen Pressfield, who wrote Gates of Fire,
Yeah.
He wrote something called The Tides of War, which is about Alcibiades' disaster and Syracuse, before the walls of Syracuse.
Yeah, that's a
But
good
he
book.
also wrote two Alexander novels, The Virtues of War
Hmm.
and The Afghan Campaign. And he could not get a major publisher for the Afghan campaign because
Surprise.
he took a realistic view of the Afghan campaign. That's where Alexander was reduced to committing many war crimes,
Hmm.
and it really broke the moral spirit of his army because it was a dirty war. The only two people that ever conquered Afghanistan were the Mongols and Alexander.
Yeah, the
Nobody
British
else.
couldn't the British couldn't do it and the Russians couldn't do it.
And what? We've been there for 20 years now.
Yeah.
Okay, so these are the only two people that. Well, you know how the Mongols did business, right? You know, pyramids and skulls.
Yeah.
That's that settles a lot of rough spots. But uh, Alexander was a guy that basically wanted to intermarry and ally with the people he conquered, and then he runs into these Pashtun assholes, and they're just not budging. So he's got to wipe them out. He doesn't have to wipe all of them out. He's according to the one source, he slaughtered all the Kshatriyas in the Punjab. Well, the Kshatriyas, that's the whole warrior caste. It
Yeah.
was written as if it was a tribe. But there was, in the Afghan campaign, it's not from the point of view of Alexander. He's basically like the celebrity leader that rides in the camp. The first one, The Virtues of War, is a lot from Alexander and Hephaestion.
Okay.
But from the Afghan campaign is from the point of view of these follow-on troopers that get sent over. They're like the later Macedonian replacements. And it's a real dirty, ugly war. It's like, fighting the Apaches or something. And Pressfield effectively wrote himself out of a major book contract because he predicted the failure of the U.S. military. And this was in 2008, I think, when he wrote the book in Afghanistan. So,
Gates of Fire was great.
yeah. Yeah, and that's what the comic book guy ripped it off and made billions off of.
Hmm. God, that movie is so cartoonish. Um, the
Did you see the first one, the 300 Spartans?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I saw that when I was a kid. That's what got me interested in Greek history.
Okay.
I saw that movie, and my father took me to this library, and when I was 11, and found me a book on ancient history, and I found the account of the Battle of Thermopylae.
Awesome. Yeah, and it's interesting how it's just how I go back to Themistocles where the Athenians had this ostracism practice, which is pretty interesting. Like, can you imagine us deciding the 10 people we're going to exile every year or something?
Well, that's really normal. I mean, they wrote about it, but that's they did end up killing some of their own people too. But how a normal tribal societies work. Now, Athens was made up of either 10, 11, or 12 tribes. It was actually made up of tribes. Some of the Greek polis, some of their communities were made up of clans. Some of them were made up of tribes. But they were all multiples. None of them were a single tribe. And Athens was one of the bigger ones because it was a lot of people that were assholes that were exiled from other communities that came there. It was basically like a pirate's den. So they do keep alive. Ostracism is like the healthiest thing a society can do that's trying to avoid eating itself.
Yeah.
Okay, because what most civilizations end up doing is they end up imprisoning people within them or killing them. Okay, and now we're figuring out a way to morally and socially erase you without doing either. In our current society, the Athenians were still, at least for their highest ranking citizens, treating them like a band of American Indians would treat one of their people that broke a rule, which is, you're dead to us, you have to go, which is potentially a death sentence in a tribal world.
Yeah. And in
You know,
Themistocles' case, he when it's like he goes, and then the bad part of it is that they, while he's ostracized, they then accuse him of treason, with the plot, that Pausanias Spartan fiasco thing, and so it's like he basically, goes from being ostracized to being accused of treason, which I don't think he committed treason. And he then flees Greece and goes to Asia Minor eventually, which other people do besides him. But
remember, in the 300 Spartans, in the beginning, when the Persians are marching to Thermopylae, they have a Spartan, an exiled Spartan king with them.
yeah,
This is very common. If you're an empire, you could really manipulate your orbital tribal societies in small city states by just accepting their exiles. So this is a very good imperial policy, to accept exiles.
and the sad thing about Themistocles is that he ends up committing suicide. I wonder, what really did him in, as far as, I guess it was just too much thinking about how the hero of the Battle of Salamis, and also someone that had, fought at Marathon before that.
Well, I believe he's part of Victor Davis Hanson's Savior Generals book.
Mm-hmm.
Themistocles, he's the classic one, the example of the guy that is willing to take risks that the other people in society will not take. He saves them, and then they punish him because they have a hard time coexisting with somebody like him, in the normal day to day. So he probably fit that. That was probably his best pick. All of his picks were excellent. I really like that book. Belisarius is my favorite, the Byzantine general who virtually takes back a third of the old Roman Empire with an understrength force, and is then recalled and blinded by his masters. I think they even bring him back once after they blind him because they can't figure something out, because the eunuch that took over his job, I think his name was Nestor, screwed something up. Talk about totally getting screwed. Patton.
Yeah.
Everybody in the military hated him, but they needed him, that they wanted to win.
And I mean, it's like, if I don't know, it takes a lot of gumption too on his part, on Themistocles' part, when you're in the heat of this, existential threat to, basically threaten the rest of the Greeks, like, hey, if y'all don't get in line and help us out, we've had our city burn. We'll go ahead and just take our Tyrian boats and our ships and go make another Athens. Fuck y'all. That's a badass, because he got the Spartans to get in line, at least to an extent.
Well, they were radically conservative. That's not too much of an oxymoron. They were strictly conservative. They were very tied to their different religious obligations and everything.
Yeah.
So that would be a problematical ally. It's like, we can't fight. It's Sunday. So that's what kind of people they were. But it contributed to their unique strengths.
And I mean, let's go ahead and talk about a little bit about, you said I think we were off air when you said that two of your favorite other Savior generals are Sherman and Bedford Forrest.
Right, and they were enemies. Sherman put a price on Forrest's head. called him that devil, put $10,000 on his head, just wanted him killed because he was causing him such a headache. Now, William Tecumseh Sherman is named after Tecumseh, and he didn't call himself William T. Sherman, didn't call himself William Sherman. He was always William Tecumseh Sherman because he was very proud of being named after this rebel Indian who led a pan-Indian alliance against the United States, and then were then stabbed in the back by the British and hung out to dry at a crucial battle. Now, Sherman had problems with his sanity. You know, he's a person that was, you know, suffered horrible depressions, would have spent his life under psychiatric care if he lived today, had been heavily medicated probably most of his life. But he was also not that good in the peacetime military. But in war, he functioned very highly. So he seems to have been a case of somebody who is crazy, but when the world goes crazy, he's the perfect guy to deal with it. And he said from the beginning that he would, because he knew that. Now, the guy that just got screwed out of the throne on the Potomac, okay, was the only president in U.S. history that was not either a military commander or a professional politician. He was an anomaly. Okay, will not happen again. I do not believe. But the Sherman knew that the way, particularly the guy he was named after, the defeat of Tecumseh put two presidents in office. If you had anything to do with that campaign, you were headed to the White House. So he knew that war success in the United States was a sure route to the White House. When it was first mentioned, he said, I will never run for office, and I will never accept nomination office, ever. He knew he was unsuited for it. He's not a peacetime guy. He knew war was hell. He said that, and his job was to extinguish the flames he thrived in, which makes him a pretty uniquely negating character. Hansen points out accurately that while Ulysses S. Grant got 100,000 poor white trash from urban cities killed in Virginia, going up against Bobby Lee, that Sherman killed a couple hundred folks in the South that were not military combatants, and burned a bunch of mansions and burned a factory and did terrorize the very elite Deep South people who pushed the border states into that war. Tennessee didn't want to secede from the Union, but they went to war against the Union when the Union invaded Tennessee to get to the Deep South. You know, Bobby Lee would not fight outside of the Army of Northern Virginia. He would not defend the West. He was only defending his state. He refused appointment elsewhere. He knew the war would be won in the West, and there was never a general after Shiloh that was elevated to the position of commander in the West that would have facilitated that, and he knew that. He was just fighting for the protection of his state and the honor of his state. The only way that the war in the West could have been won would have been if Nathan Bedford Forrest would have been left to command it with like-minded souls, and he was socially unacceptable. He could never, he started out as a private. He was not a war college graduate like Sherman. There was no possible way he could be. It was a miracle he became a major general. Okay, that was a miracle. There was no way after he threatens to slap Braxton Bragg, who was an idiot, that he's ever going to be a general, because it was the Deep South people, the people that owned the most acreage, the most slaves, and represented the smallest slice of the population, that really pushed for something, that pushed for secession. So Sherman went directly for those people. You know, he did not want to content himself with murdering every poor, you know, Southern boy that could be put barefoot out there with a rifle to fight the Union. he went for the operational victory instead of what Grant was doing, which is just making Bobby Lee face the arithmetic. And he's just going to, he doesn't care how many New Yorkers or how many Irishmen off the boat get ground up in this meat grinder. He's going to win because that's the skill set he's got. Grant just doesn't give a shit about human beings. So he's good with that. Sherman was actually a more sensitive character. He didn't want to see more bloodshed than necessary. He knew the more terrible you made it, the quicker people would get sick of it. And he knew how important the forest was. And he put a price on his head like he was a criminal, even though he was a legitimate enemy combatant. Because, again, if he could get rid of forest, he could loosen up a vast quantity of supplies and a lot of rear echelon troops for deeper garrison duty. Because of forest, he actually had to unhook from a supply line and do that daring march down to Atlanta and the sea. Okay. Because he just could never get rid of this asshole that was in his backfield. They weren't controlling numbers of men that made them viable combatants. I mean, the most men Forrest ever had under his command was 5,000. And Sherman could lay his hands on 10 times that. So there was the Forrest essentially spent his entire 4 years defending Tennessee. He fought some outside of that, but for the most part, he was defending his native state against the northern aggressor. And I think he had 34 horses shot out from underneath of him, was proud of the fact that he killed 35 enemy with his own hands, including close range pistol shots and sword thrusts. He was in about as many battles, about 35 battles, lost one of them, and was the kind of guy that, could have taken the West a lot more cleanly than Sherman and Sheridan did, or could have defended the West if he was an Indian, and and could lay his hands on enough captured supplies. So he's kind of like a Tennessee crazy horse. So
yeah, I mean, Forrest seems like a type of guy that was a born killer. But I mean, from what I know about him, it's like he even that violent before the war popped off.
Okay. When he was 13 years old, his father died.
Mm-hmm.
He had already become infamous in the neighborhood because as a 10-year-old boy, he stood up against two large hounds. So he could have torn him limb from limb, but he stood up to the hounds that would go out there and chase people. When he was 15, his mother and aunt were attacked by a panther. He had a single shot muzzle loader. He took his dog. He went out in the woods by night, and he stayed out there until he killed the panther. When a neighbor threatened to kill, there was a dispute with a cow. Either his cow was breaking down a neighbor's fence, or the neighbor's cow was breaking down his mother's fence. The neighbor threatened the Forrest family, and little Nathan threatened the neighbor, who was a grown man, and the neighbor knew better. So Nathan was known as a stand-up guy. So a man that was involved in the slave trade, which meant that other slave traders were looking to kill you, okay, in Tennessee, enlisted him as a business partner. And Nathan didn't have anything to put up but his balls. Okay, so 4 men ambushed them. His partner is gunned down. Nathan guns down one of these guys, wings another one, and then with only a Bowie knife in front of the whole town, he charges the last 2 guys that still have guns, and they run away. So his reputation is made. This guy's a badass.
Yeah.
Okay. First gunfight, lays 2 guys out, and even after his gun is empty, he's coming after you with a knife. Okay. So he's 5'10", 5'11", 180 pounds. Not brilliant mechanically. He loved to wrestle. He was extremely strong. He was fearless. He had problems with anger. He he had a really hard time with people who mistreated their hounds, their horses, or their Negroes. Okay, he went into the slave trading business because he saw that if you advertised the fact that you treated your human property humanely, and you advertised the fact that you fed them well and you did not beat them, and you would promise to take them back if they misbehaved, that you could make a lot of money in the slave trade, which is the trade that he basically walked into working as his uncle's bodyguard.
Do you
Okay.
have any anecdotes about him, uh, like fighting somebody because they mistreated their hounds or dogs? Is that like did so like I wonder if there's any stories about him fighting somebody over a dog.
No, I don't.
Yeah,
I don't recall that.
yeah,
He did. He did kill a guy with a penknife who had shot him, and
yeah.
then apologized to the guy for that. That was on a point of honor. He did beat some Confederate soldiers that were doing something wrong.
Yeah.
Uh, one at one point, there was uh, he had a famous horse named King Philip uh, that actually hated men in blue so much that when he was being used to carry a funeral casket on a carriage, he saw a bunch of police cadets drilling in the street and he charged them. Okay, so that's how loyal this horse was. He had he freed all of his slaves. He had been planning on divesting himself from the slave business because he considered it dishonorable. And
This is something that nobody will talk about right now. Like if
okay,
they
no,
hear, yeah, forced, they just immediately think awful.
dude,
Yeah.
he had 10 he had 10 African American men in his personal bodyguard that served as troopers. When he freed his 51 slaves, one of them went north, and the other 50 either served with him as soldiers or they continued to work for him for pay. He went to trial for murder again and stood before a mixed race jury for the crime of defending an African American woman against an African American man who was beating him to death. And at this point, he was an old man, and the young man was much larger than him. And Nathan beat him to death with an axe handle. And then when the wife beater's friends came to settle the score, old Nathan came out in the yard with his 6-gun and said, "I'm here to settle it." And they all went home. He turned himself in for trial, and he was acquitted by a mixed race jury. He floated a plan to buy African slaves. This was after the Civil War because so many men in the South had been killed. He floated a plan to buy African slaves, give them their freedom, bring them to America, and pay them a fair wage for work. Everybody thought he was nuts, so it didn't happen. And maybe he was nuts. He's regarded as the person that founded the Ku Klux Klan, but he did not. He disbanded the Ku Klux Klan.
Why is he why is he connected with founding
Okay.
the Ku Klux Klan?
Okay, so there's 3 iterations of the Ku Klux Klan. There's the current FBI front group. Okay, that's what they are. They're all FBI agents.
Yeah.
There is the second iteration of the Klan, which was all about getting rid of and terrorizing African American people, which is the Klan that we think of.
Yeah.
There was the first iteration of the Klan, which was founded by 4 men, which included his one-time co-commander and subordinate, a good Confederate colonel named Chalmers, who, along with Nathan, saved a bunch of Negroes from a massacre, okay, at Fort Pillow. We can get to that later. Now, he and these other 3 guys had been dealing with Reconstruction in Tennessee. The governor of Tennessee had actually declared that every man that had fought for the Confederacy in Tennessee, because not all of them had, Tennessee split. 1/3 of the men went for the Union, 2/3 of the men went for the South. Before the Civil War, when it came to secession, Tennessee voted against secession, but then not. But then, even though Tennessee did not vote to secede, when Lincoln declared that he was invading Tennessee, two-thirds of Tennesseans voted to go with the Confederacy and fight the North because they didn't want to be invaded. They did not appreciate that. So it was obviously a ploy by the Union just to drag them into the war so that they can gobble them up and use them as a supply head because of the river system and everything. But so at the end of the war, the carpetbaggers come down and the loyalist Tennesseans, the Union loyalists, they gain control. The governor declares that they're actually going to kill all of the native Tennesseans that fought for the Confederacy. So the Ku Klux Klan is raised as an organization to defend white Tennesseans against white Tennesseans.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
Then Forrest is brought in. Once Forrest is brought in, well, you're looking at possibly another civil war because the North is still terrified of this guy. They had wanted him to be court-martialed. Because this is the guy that didn't lose. Right?
Yeah.
So, and he's got the moral authority. So he told people in Washington, said, I can raise 40,000 men and they'll be hell to pay. So call your dogs off. Do not allow your men in Tennessee to slaughter their fellow Tennesseans. Now, while this is happening, chapters of this start sprouting up all over the South. And during Reconstruction, there was people from the North had inflamed a lot of racial animosity in the South. They were, for instance, disarming Caucasians and arming Africans and redistributing things, okay? A lot of African Americans and Caucasian Americans were getting along just fine after the Civil War, but there were troublemakers from the North, and there were some troublemakers in the South, and there were problems. So then the KKK starts going after black people in other states, and Nathan didn't like that. He had a history of getting along very good with colored folk. He would routinely have barbecues with them and ask them what they needed, and then he would make sure they got what they needed, and he treated them with respect, and he respected them. So he told him, and he also didn't like the outfits. He thought it was humiliating. So he said, put the funny costumes away and leave the colored folk alone and go home. Okay, so that was the end of it. He didn't start it. He disbanded it. And he also did not organize the slaughter of African-American troops at Fort Pillow. What happened is African-American troops had been sent against his troops wearing no quarter badges that had been knitted for them and put on their vests in hope of causing a Confederate slaughter of the African-American troops who were announcing that they were not going to take Confederate prisoners and that they were going to murder the Confederates after they surrendered by wearing this badge. The African Americans were being used by the North in this unfortunate manner in order to incite a war crime to get more support from Great Britain for the Union War effort. So once they take Fort Pillow against white and black troops, with white and black troops, Forrest has black troops with him, Forrest sees that there's a whole riverboat of Yankee reinforcements are going to be landed, and he already took a place that outnumbered him by like 3-1. He was already in a shit situation, so he was always fascinated by artillery and didn't know how to use it. So he goes up to this turret to where this gun is, and he's trying to figure out how to use this thing, okay, with the assistance of one of his artillerymen, and he's obsessed with trying to blow this transport boat out of the water. Meanwhile, his Tennessee troops were slaughtering their white Tennessee enemies because these guys had been raping their wives and their sisters and their mothers, okay, because the Confederates were out of town and the Union Tennesseans were in town, and they had access to the women of the rebel Confederates. And that's where the slaughter starts there, these grudges, and then you got all these black guys wearing no quarter patches. So the good old boys start killing some of them too, because they were going to kill them. So turnabout was fair play. And Chalmers sees this and he's horrified. He's a West Point graduate. He's not going to have this happen on his watch. And he sends somebody to notify Forrest, and him and Forrest stop the massacre before it goes too far. Some of them do get killed. All right. So Forrest then writes a letter to his Union counterpart across the river, and he said, in so many words, you should be ashamed about how you're treating these Negro soldiers. You should not be putting those no quarter badges on them, and you should be treating them fairly and not using them for these dastardly purposes. So he was a man of honor, and to my knowledge, he only slew 2 African Americans. One of them is a man who tried to kill him in a battle. He was a Union soldier, and Nathan let him shoot first, and then when the man missed, he shot him dead. And then the other guy was the buck that he killed with the axe handle when he was an old man. So and yet you got to dig up his body and his wife's body, because he was supposedly somebody that hated African Americans when he was essentially their advocate, even when he was a slave trader.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it was just at some point in the history, I guess, around the civil rights movement, someone decided to use him as to revise history and make him into a scapegoat and whatever.
Well, you see his picture and you can't find guilt anywhere there. And guilt is the complexion we are supposed to wear. Okay. As survivors of this misbegotten country. So he fits the bill as the villain. Now, from Sherman's point of view, people like Forrest were horrible, because why did Sherman think people like Forrest? And why did the free soil men under Sherman, think people like Forrest were horrible? Because Forrest was, according to them, a lover of African Americans, because he spread them with his economy, with his plantations, with his slave trading, and they denied work to European American men. So the troops that came from Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Kansas were men and the sons of men and the grandsons of men who had all been driven from Virginia farms way back when, because of the slave economy. You can't run a family farm down the road from Wade Hampton, who owns 200 slaves, because you cannot compete with him. And on top of that, since Wade Hampton owns more than 10 slaves, he doesn't have to go on slave catcher patrol, and you do, in the middle of the night, to protect your property, because Wade doesn't lock up his slaves, because they don't rob his stuff, they rob your stuff. And you know what? If you're an African slave that's stuck on a plantation, you don't get paid for your work, and there's some poor white people that live down the road that have some stuff, why not go rob them? After all, it's white people that own you. Okay, so this dynamic of unsecured slaves who basically, through crime in the middle of the night, drive away the surrounding people, that opens up cheap land for their owner to buy. And it also suppresses the wage economy, means that young men can't get wage earning jobs, and they have to go west. So the Free Soil Act, the Free Soil Party, is totally unheard of, but it's about not spreading slavery, which to them meant not spreading Africans, because the Africans were the group of people that stayed in slavery the longest. The groups of people before them fought so hard against it that they ran away in such numbers, and they staged so many bloody uprisings that eventually nobody tried to stop them, and rewards for runaway white boys by 1820 were down to 6 cents from $5 in 2000 in 1812. 1812, $5 for a runaway Caucasian. 1820, 6 cents. It was no longer worth it. Okay, so the residual slave economy now rested with the African Americans, and they were seen as part of the problem because they were the hands that did the work that put the free people out of work. Okay, and their owners were seen as people who liked them, and part of that dynamic comes from the plantation era, which we can talk about at a different time. But Sherman sees Forrest as partially being a bad person because he is promoting the African American slave economy at the expense of the free Anglo American homestead economy. And it turns out that Sherman's army wins that battle because he's got more men, because they're the grandsons of the men who couldn't make a living in the Confederacy, that had to move into the Ohio Valley to make a living, to get away from the slave economy, which basically sets the stage for the victory of the Union because they have the larger number of free men with a stake in society and a gun to go fight the war. So that's a history of the Confederacy that you're not going to. It's probably not legal to even discuss, but you can check all the sources. So the two biographies for a look at Sherman, I'd suggest Victor Davis Hanson's Savior Generals. The two biographies of Nathan Bedford Forrest. A Battle from the Start by Nathan Steele, by Brian Steele Wills, and Bust Hell Wide Open by an author I cannot recall the name of. They're both excellent, and they do not retrace a lot of the same ground. The second author tried not to step on Steele Wills' work that much, and instead complimented it and did an excellent job. There's another character from this period, Captain Jack Hansen, who is said killed up to 100 men as a sniper with a specially made rifle after he was a friend not only of Nathan Bedford Forrest, but of Ulysses S. Grant.
Dang.
And he stayed neutral in the war. But
someone killed a kid, right, or something?
They beheaded both of his sons and put their heads, the Union soldiers did this, not by Grant's orders, it was a lower down guy, placed both their heads on his fence post of his gate to his front yard. So then he declared a personal war on the Union. He even captured a riverboat by himself, a gunboat, a ship of war. And one of the things he spent a great deal of time doing was protecting the Black Hinsons. They were the former slaves of his family who he had freed. And he willed all of his property to them. And they put him up when he was doing his sniping duties. They'd bring him food. They'd let him come by for a rest. And then Captain Jack Henson found out that the Union troops were abusing the Black Hinsons, who, after all, were his relatives, because these people interbred. Okay? It was a high status thing for the African American woman to be impregnated by her owner. Okay? I mean, so it was sometimes rape. It was not necessarily always rape. But in any case, they're blood relatives. So Captain Jack Henson actually wipes out and hunts down and wipes out the Union patrols who are raping his African American female relatives, and he's a Caucasian American. And there are also criminal gangs that are not Union and are not Confederate that are preying on the Black Hinsons, and they're preying on Union soldiers, and they're preying on Confederate soldiers and civilians. And he hunted them to extinction by himself. He knew that it was the land he grew up in. He never went outside of the county of his birth, I believe. And once he had killed enough, he took his gun to Nathan Bedford Forrest and walked away. So I'm done.
Oh, he's one of those guys that did his killing and
walked away. And he was eventually murdered, I believe.
Damn.
By some other white Southerner. Okay.
Did it have any? Do you know if it had anything to do with like a vendetta?
It's been like 2 years since I read the book. I forget. But he wasn't apparently at any fault. He seemed to be a completely stand-up guy that didn't even want to get involved in the war. Subject to a tragedy. He protected all the people he could. He let, instead of continuing to shoot the Union sailors and soldiers on his river gunboat. He let them surrender to him, and even though he was not in a position to take control of the boat, he let them sail away under their own power. Okay, yeah. So he was a humane guy. He was an honorable guy, but he was another guy in Tennessee that was put in the middle of this situation that they didn't want to be in, and at a certain point, they end up protecting African American people from
Yeah.
Anglo American Northerners.
God.
Okay,
Yeah, it
but
seems
you
like a
can't hear that.
terrible. Yeah,
You
it
can't
seems
hear
like
that.
a terrible situation though, because you got like bushwhackers or whatever you want to call them, bandits, in the middle of the Civil War, plus,
Yeah.
opposing forces. And
So
um,
it's
how
somebody
did
like. Go ahead.
oh, sorry, like, how I was gonna say, like, to kind of close up a little bit, like how I wanted to know, and I'm sure the audience wants to know if they don't know, does how does Sherman and Forrest have a decent death? Do they live to be like? Do they die horribly, or do they kind of just get old and die?
Forrest was shot a few times during the
Okay.
war. He had a mini ball permanently lodged next to his spine.
Mm,
Uh, he spent when he was around 40 years. He spent 4 years in the saddle fighting sword fights, getting shot, being out in the cold, and he died in terrible pain and misery. Okay, he was relatively dynamic until his last few years. One time, he was even on a train full of Union soldiers that derailed, and he took command of the Union soldiers and made them, repair the tracks, which were his troops used to tear up Union tracks, and so he's actually repairing a train wreck of the kind that he used to be in the business of causing. Uh, he died a terrible death.
mm,
His great grandson was killed piloting, I think, a B-17 over Germany or Holland. Uh, the uh, uh, the Wehrmacht shot him down, and I believe they held a military funeral for him because they knew who he was. He was a general. I think it was a Brigadier General Nathan Bedford Forrest Jr., but he was like the grandson or great grandson of Nathan Bedford Forrest. Uh, I'm currently writing a alternate history uh, uh, novel in which the South won the Civil War, and there is an expeditionary force of Confederates fighting in Operation Barbarossa under General George S. Patton and Nathan Bedford Forrest Jr. Okay. So that's probably that book should get banned. Uh, now it's titled Rebel Nell, Knell. Okay, so yeah, I mean, it's a chance, and also the captain of the troop of African American Confederate soldiers is none other than Jesse Owens. It's called the Bantu hand grenade. Okay, the T-34s cannot outrun him when he's got a satchel charge. So anyhow, the that'll get me in trouble sometime this year. But the Sherman, I do not know how Sherman died. I believe somebody died carrying his casket at a funeral because they refused to wear their hat in the rain. Uh, and I don't know what circumstances he died under. Grant died of tongue cancer and managed to get enough residual money for his family to live on by writing his biography, which was one of the few noble things he did.
Well, it looks like Sherman lived to be 71. He died in
And
18 months. That's good.
now Sherman did command, I think, the Department of the Interior, uh, and the man under him was General Sheridan, the psychopathic Irish American prick, who's the guy that would have basically been the Union Nathan Bedford Forrest. And the man that fought under Sheridan during the Civil War in many bloody engagements was General George Armstrong Custer. So you know what ended up happening to him. Custer Custer was the rival of a guy named John Singleton Mosby, who was a Shenandoah Valley partisan commander of light irregular horse. But anyhow, he was fighting against Sheridan's command. Custer was under Sheridan in the Civil War in the Shenandoah and also in the far west. And so when Custer gets slaughtered, he's actually technically a couple tiers down under Sheridan's command, and Sheridan is under Sherman. So Sherman actually ends up supervising the uh, the, the defeat of the Native Americans, the Lakota particularly, and that earlier on, before the Civil War, Sheridan refused to take military action against the ever vigilant army that basically lynched the murderers in San Francisco while they locked up the corrupt police and the corrupt politicians. Sherman, that's probably the most noble thing he ever did was he refused to side with the corrupt governor and mayor and police commissioner in San Francisco, and he let the vigilant army take care of it because many of those men had been American veterans who had defeated the Mexican forces in 1848 in conquering California and taking it from the Mexicans.
Was he just out there as part of being the department?
He had a post with, I think it was the Department of the Interior, and he was the man on the scene, and he should have, the governor called upon him to do his duty and take command. Yeah. And then he said that he could not honorably do so because the situation was so bad.
I mean, he was pretty popular though, too, right? I mean, among
he wasn't popular with his commanders. Other than Grant, Sherman was not popular with his commanders. So he had a lot of similarities with Patton. He had problems with his sanity.
Yeah. Yeah.
Him and Grant both had problems with alcohol.
Weren't they like failed businessmen too in different capacities before the war?
Yes. Yeah. So they had a real hard time with non-wartime activity, but they were excellent in wartime. And you know what? Grant's not as nearly as noble a character as Sherman, but in a lot of ways, he was the guy that permitted Sherman to do what Sherman needed to do.
Yeah, he at least recognized talent in that capacity, I guess, to give him the freedom to
and
win the war. I guess.
But there was the thing that, there's the guy that can kill the guy. Okay.
Yeah.
And then there's the guy that can't. Well, then there's the guy that can send men to their death, knowing that they're going to die, and the guy that can't, and the guy that has a hard time with it. Grant was the guy that had no problem sending tens of thousands of young men to their death, knowing that they were just there to soak up enemy lead.
I think that's worse than the townspeople in High Plains Drifter.
Yeah.
So they're both bad. The characters.
There was that. But Forrest had the lead men. He couldn't just send them in. Sherman could not stomach his men taking high casualties.
Yeah. So
he chose maneuver.
Yeah.
Grant did to a certain extent in the West. Okay. But it was easier to do. Robert E. Lee is a character that does not want to lose any more men than he has to, and it hurts him every time his men get killed, and they know it. And tragically, it kind of makes them fight even harder and get killed at a higher rate.
And it seems how much like they loved him.
Yeah,
really,
So it seems like that really ate him up.
Yeah. Yeah, man. I think that's a good place to end. So we've answered some audience questions earlier, and we went straight through to give you all some examples of some generals and leaders that by their own people in a lot of ways just were not. I keep thinking about High Plains Drifter and having to take care of people that despise you for what you have to do.
Before I forget, Nathan Bedford Forrest was the primary basis for the fantasy character Conan the Barbarian.
Oh, really?
The author, Robert E. Howard, his uncle rode under Forrest. His family came from Mississippi. He wrote in East Texas, but the generation before him were Mississippians. And he wrote a very touching Civil War story named For the Love of Barbara Allen. And his descriptions of Forrest in that are almost identical to some of the descriptions of the Conan character. Plus, the the mountain, the rural southern mountain upbringing was really the basis. That the misty mountains around Tennessee and Arkansas is kind of the basis for the fantasy land of Samaria, which is the place where Conan's race tribe of barbarians supposedly came from. They were mountain barbarians, and it was somewhat conflated in the idea of like the Irish and Scottish fighting men, the Gaels, which in terms of lineage they were. These people could trace their lineage back to Irish, Scotch, and Scotch-Irish people. So that probably most famous fantasy character is at the core based on that character of Nathan Bedford Forrest, with a bunch of people that Howard knew when he was an accountant. His uncle was a half-breed Indian. He knew his father was a doctor that treated like oil field roughnecks for their injuries and stuff. So he's a mixture of some different adventurous types of people.
I would have, I would have never guessed it.
And his character, Solomon Kane, is based on his father. Was based on Robert E. Howard's father, who was a Bible thumping doctor that dressed in black a lot and wore a black hat, and the Virginia pioneer, Captain John Smith, who also fought the Turks in Eastern Europe and was once held as a slave of the Ottoman Turks, as was the character Solomon Kane. So
John Smith was a slave before by the Ottoman Turks?
Yeah, he was held for a while. He claims that the affection of one of the women in the harem resulted in him being released to sneak out. Yeah, so that was John Smith was a totally interesting guy.
He was also, like you said, the enforcer.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like he also sold one of his boys right off the bat. Like
yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. What else you gonna do with a boy? Boy means slave. Okay.
But this little kid wasn't his blood, was he? And not that it really mattered. It makes it that much better.
He was just a random. He had a name. I can't remember his name. He was sold to Powhatan.
Yeah.
And Powhatan, as most Indians did, released him and adopted him, and was later offended when the boy left because he had treated him so well. He's like, "You're my son. Why would you leave?" But he was one of those rare cases of an Anglo-American boy who lived with the Indians and decided not to stay with the Indians. Most of them just decided to stay with the Indians.
God, I would pick his brain, man. I would. How awesome would it be to have a journal from that kid, man? Anyway, it's been good talking to you, James, and I look forward to talking to you again. Everybody listening, thank you for listening. And is there any closing things that you would like to say?
Well, I'd just like to thank you and your listeners for their questions. It helps. You never know when you missed a detail. Like I didn't cite Grossman's book, for instance, when we talked last time. So that's always helpful quite a bit.
Yeah. All right, guys. This is Rusty with Rusty Vignettes and James Lafond. Until next time, take care, and I'll talk to y'all later.